Dust devils dance across the Texas plains as a young woman's scream pierces the evening air. Sarah Mitchell, barely 17, watches helplessly as ruthless outlaws raid her father's ranch. But among the bandits, one pair of eyes holds not malice, but something deeper, a hidden pain, a flicker of recognition. As the gang disappears into the Badlands with Sarah in tow, her father marshals a determined posse. Yet in the dead of night, when the outlaws make camp, that same mysterious bandit risks everything to help her escape. In the pale moonlight, Sarah catches sight of something on his wrist, a crescent-shaped birthmark that makes her heart stop. Could this outlaw be the baby brother her family lost 15 years ago? But if he is her brother, how did he end up riding with outlaws? And what dark secrets from their family's past might explain his fate? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Evening Star Ranch had been Mitchell land for 3 generations, its weathered sign creaking in the warm Texas breeze like an old man's whispered memories. James Mitchell stood at his kitchen window, weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold, watching his daughter Sarah tend to the horses in the morning light. She moved with her mother's grace, he thought, though he'd never tell her that. Some memories were still too painful to voice. The family Bible sat open on the kitchen table behind him, its pages worn thin with time and grief. There was a gap where a page had been torn out 15 years ago, the day after they lost Thomas. James's wife, Mary, had ripped it out in a moment of despair, unable to bear seeing their son's birth record next to Sarah's. The torn edge remained, a ragged reminder of their broken family. Sarah's laughter drifted through the window as she worked, a sound that both warmed James's heart and pierced it. She was 17 now, the same age Mary had been when they'd first met. The ranch had been struggling back then, but Mary's father had seen something in young James Mitchell that went beyond the empty cattle pens and unpaid bills. A man's worth isn't in his pocket, the old rancher had said, but in the steel of his spine and the truth in his eyes. James had proven that faith well-founded, building the Evening Star into one of the most respected ranches in the territory. But success had come with a price he'd never intended to pay. The night they took Thomas, just 6 months old, James had been in town arranging a cattle sale that would finally clear the ranch's debts. Mary had been alone with the children when the strangers came. Sarah only remembered fragments of that night. A baby's cry suddenly silenced, her mother's screams, the thunder of hooves fading into darkness. She'd been barely 2 years old, but some terrors sink too deep to fade. For years afterward, she'd wake in the night, crying for a brother she'd never really known. Mary had never truly recovered. She'd spent years searching every face she saw, convinced she'd recognize her son even as he grew. The local sheriff had followed every lead, every rumor of child snatchers and roving gangs, but Thomas had vanished like morning mist in the sun. 10 years after that night, Mary's heart had finally given out, though James knew it had really broken long before. Sarah finished with the horses and made her way back to the house, her boots leaving dusty prints on the porch boards. She paused at the door, watching her father through the window. He stood so still sometimes, lost in thoughts she could only guess at. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and for the first time, she noticed how it had spread since spring. "Coffee's cold, Daddy," she said as she entered, taking the mug from his hands and moving to the stove. The familiar routine of morning coffee was their ritual, a quiet moment before the day's work began. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" James didn't need to answer. The Bible on the table said enough. Sarah poured fresh coffee for them both, adding a touch of honey to her father's cup the way her mother used to. "I dream about him sometimes," she said softly. "Not memories. I was too young for those, but I dream of who he might have become." "Your mother always said he'd have your eyes," James replied, his voice rough with emotion. "The same green as the spring grass He took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth chase away the morning chill. She never lost hope, your mama, even at the end. Sarah moved to the table, her fingers tracing the Bible's worn leather cover. "Tell me again about the birthmark," she said, though she knew the story by heart. It was another ritual, this retelling, of the few facts they had. "Crescent-shaped on his right wrist," James said, the words familiar as a prayer. "Like a new moon laid on its back. The midwife said she'd never seen anything like it." He smiled faintly. "Your mother called it his angel's mark, said God had put it there so we'd always know him." The morning light streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, a cow lowed, and the distant sound of the ranch hands beginning their day drifted in. Life went on, as it had to, but the empty space at their table remained like a wound that wouldn't heal. "I still keep his room ready," Sarah said, though they both knew this. Every week she dusted the small bedroom, aired out the blankets, replaced the flowers in the jar on the windowsill. Mama always said he'd need a home to come back to. James reached across the table and took his daughter's hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Your mother was right about most things," he said. "She was right about you, said you'd grow up strong and true, and you have." He squeezed her hand once before letting go. "Whatever happened to Thomas, wherever he is, I have to believe he grew up strong too. Mitchell blood runs deep." Sarah nodded, rising to begin her day's work, but she paused at the door, looking back at her father. "We'll find him someday, Daddy, or he'll find us. Mama's angel mark will lead him home." James watched her go, his daughter's faith a bitter comfort. The Bible lay open before him, its torn page a testament to dreams deferred but never abandoned. Outside, the Evening Star ranch sign creaked in the wind, marking time like a metronome, counting the days until a family might be made whole again. In the attic of the Mitchell house, a small silver rattle lay nestled in a cedar box, its surface dulled by time but still bearing the initials TM carefully engraved on its handle. It had been Mary's last gift to her son, given the morning before he was taken. Sarah held it now, the weight of it familiar in her palm, listening to the faint tinkle that still emerged when she shook it, a ghost of a baby's laugh long silenced. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty attic window, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Sarah had retreated here after the morning's conversation, drawn to this sanctuary of memories, as she often was when the weight of absence pressed too heavily. The rattle was just one of many treasures she kept here, each a piece of the puzzle that was her lost brother. Doc Wilson's wife, Martha, had given Sarah the full story years ago, when she was old enough to understand. Martha had been there the night Thomas was born, assisting her husband with the delivery. "Your mama was so proud," she told Sarah, her eyes misty with remembrance. "She kept saying, 'Look at his little wrist, look at his mark.' Even through her exhaustion, she was certain that mark meant something special." Sarah placed the rattle back in its box, her fingers lingering on the smooth silver. Below, she could hear her father talking with Hank Townsend, their closest neighbor, and one of the few people who'd never stopped helping them search for Thomas. Hank's deep voice carried through the floorboards, discussing cattle prices and water rights, but Sarah knew these conversations often turned to other matters, whispered reports of strangers passing through, rumors of children matching Thomas's description. The town of Copper Creek had never forgotten the Mitchell tragedy. How could they, when Mary Mitchell's grief had become a living thing, walking the streets in her Sunday best, stopping every young boy who might be the right age, studying their wrists with desperate hope? Sarah remembered holding her mother's hand during those walks, feeling it tremble each time disappointment struck anew. Sheriff Mason had been newly appointed when Thomas was taken. Sarah had found his old case notes once, carefully preserved. In his office, pages of dead ends and false leads, each one marked with increasingly frustrated notations. "Suspect described as tall, dark-haired man seen riding north," read one. "Child crying heard near Blackwater Creek. Investigation revealed Hunter's family making camp," said another. The pages went on, a testament to a lawman's dedication and a family's unending nightmare. "Your mother never gave up," the sheriff had told Sarah last year when she'd asked to see the notes again. "Even when the trail went cold, she kept believing. That kind of faith, well, it changes people, changes a whole town." He'd paused then, his weathered face thoughtful. "Some folks thought she was touched in the head near the end, but I never did. A mother knows her child's out there. Same way. She knows her own heart's beating." Sarah moved to the attic window, pressing her hand against the warm glass. From here, she could see the whole ranch spread out below. The corrals where she and her father broke horses, the barn where she'd learned to milk cows at her mother's side, the distant pastures where the cattle grazed. This was Mitchell land, built by Mitchell hands, and somewhere out there was a Mitchell son who'd never known his birthright. The sound of horses in the yard drew her attention. Hank was leaving, his wagon kicking up dust as he headed toward town. Sarah watched him go, remembering how he'd organized search parties in those first frantic days, how he'd ridden for miles, checking every homestead and camp between here and the territorial line. Even now, 15 years later, he never passed. Through a new town without asking questions, showing the sketch Mary had drawn of the birthmark. A soft knock at the attic door interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah," her father's voice called, "sun's getting low. Time to bring in the herd." "Coming, Daddy," she answered, but she took a moment more, looking out across the land that should have been her brother's heritage too. The setting sun painted the hills in shades of gold and purple, the same color she remembered from her mother's favorite shawl, the one she'd been wearing that last day when her heart finally gave out. Before leaving the attic, Sarah touched the cedar box one last time, a gesture that had become almost prayer-like over the years. "We're still here, Thomas," she whispered, words her mother had said countless times. "We're still waiting." She descended the attic stairs into the gathering dusk, the echo of the rattle's long-ago music fading behind her. Through the kitchen window, she could see her father already mounted, waiting patiently in the yard. He sat his horse, the way he carried his grief, straight-backed and dignified, bearing its weight with quiet strength. Sarah stepped out into the evening air, the familiar smell of sage and horse leather wrapping around her like a blanket. As she swung into her saddle, a covey of doves burst from the nearby mesquite, their wings catching the last rays of sunlight. Her mother used to say that doves carried messages to heaven. Sarah wondered, not for the first time, if they might carry messages the other way too, if somewhere a young man with a crescent birthmark ever looked at the evening sky and felt the pull of home, calling him back to the Evening Star Ranch, and the family that had never stopped watching for his return. The black bandana lay twisted in the dust like a fallen crow, lost in the chaos when the raiders struck. Sarah would remember it later, how it had slipped from one bandit's face, revealing features that seemed too young for such violence. But in the moment, all she could focus on was the thunder of hooves and her father's desperate shout. As the evening erupted into mayhem, it began with the dogs. Their warning barks turned to yelps of pain as shots rang out, silencing them forever. Sarah had been in the barn, finishing the evening feeding, when the first riders burst through the gate. The setting sun caught their weapons, turning gun barrels to fire as they fanned out across the yard with practiced precision. "Get down!" James Mitchell's voice carried from the house, followed by the sharp crack of his rifle. A raider's horse reared, throwing its rider, but 3 more appeared behind it. Sarah crouched in the barn's shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched her father's futile defense. The gang's leader sat his horse like a king on a throne, separate from the initial charge. His voice carried across the yard, cold as a winter stream. "Bring me the girl. Kill anyone who interferes." The words were spoken with such casual authority that their menace seemed almost an afterthought. Sarah's mind raced to the Winchester hidden in the hayloft, but movement at the barn door froze her in place. A figure slipped inside, bandana pulled high across his face, but those eyes, there was something in those eyes that made her pause. They met hers in the dimness, and for a moment neither moved. "Please," Sarah whispered, though she'd sworn never to beg for anything in her life. "My father." The young bandit's gaze flickered toward the sound of gunfire outside. Something passed across what she could see of his face, an emotion she couldn't name. Then he grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not cruel. "Don't fight," he said softly. "Fighting gets people killed." More shots exploded outside, followed by the crash of breaking wood. The ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse would be rushing to help, Sarah knew, but they'd be outnumbered. She heard Miguel, their foreman, shouting in Spanish, then a terrible silence. The young bandit pulled her toward the door, and now she did struggle despite his warning. His grip tightened. "Listen," he hissed, voice urgent. "Listen to me. The boss, he'll kill everyone if he doesn't get what he wants. But if you come quiet, there's a chance." A bullet splintered the wood beside them, and the bandit yanked her down, shielding her with his body. The gesture was instinctive, protective, at odds with everything happening around them. When he pulled back, his bandana had slipped slightly, revealing a jaw that seemed to carry an echo of someone she should know. "Sarah!" Her father's voice was closer now, tight with fear and fury. "Sarah, run!" But there was nowhere to run. More raiders were appearing at every exit, their shapes black against the dying sun. The young bandit straightened, pulling Sarah up with him. "I've got her!" he called out, and his voice carried authority despite its youth. "She's unharmed." The gang leader rode closer, his horse's hooves stirring up dust that turned blood red in the sunset. Sarah could see him clearly now, a man in his 50s, weathered as old leather, with eyes like frozen steel. He studied her with the detached interest of a man appraising livestock. "Mitchell's daughter," he said, satisfaction coloring his tone. "Pretty thing, just like her mother was." The casual reference to Mary sent a chill down Sarah's spine. How did this man know her mother? James Mitchell appeared at the corner of the barn, rifle raised, but Outlaws flanked him instantly. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, staining his collar crimson. "Let her go," he growled. "Whatever you want." "What I want," the leader cut him off, "is exactly what I'm taking." He nodded to the young bandit holding Sarah. "Get her mounted. We're losing light." Sarah felt herself being guided toward a waiting horse, her mind strangely calm, despite the terror coursing through her veins. The young bandit's hands were steady as he helped her up, his movements almost gentle. As she settled into the saddle, her father made one last, desperate move. James lunged forward, breaking free of his captors for a moment. "Sarah!" The anguish in his voice echoed across years, carrying the weight of another loss, another night when he'd been powerless to protect his family. The gang leader's gun appeared as if by magic, its barrel catching the last ray of sunlight. "That's far enough, Mitchell, unless you want to explain to your daughter why you got yourself killed." The young bandit swung up behind Sarah, taking the reins. His chest pressed against her back, and she felt his heart racing, not the steady beat of a hardened criminal, but the frightened pulse of someone perhaps as trapped as she was. "Your girl will live if you do exactly as you're told," the leader continued. "Chase us, and she dies. Send for the law, she dies. Try to be a hero." He left the threat hanging. Sarah met her father's eyes across the yard, trying to convey everything she couldn't say. His face was a mask of helpless rage and fear, the same expression he wore when speaking of the night Thomas was taken. The parallel struck her with physical force. "Daddy!" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll be all right, I promise." The words were for him, but she felt the young bandit's slight flinch behind her, as if her courage caused him pain. The gang began to move out, a well-orchestrated retreat. The leader lingered a moment longer, his cold eyes fixed on James Mitchell. "History has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it, Mitchell? Some debts take a long time to come due." Then they were riding, the Evening Star Ranch disappearing behind them as dusk settled over the land. Sarah caught one last glimpse of her, Father, standing alone in the yard, backlit by the burning bunkhouse. The black bandana still lay in the dust at his feet, a marker for where everything had changed. The young bandit's arms bracketed her as they rode, his presence both threatening and oddly reassuring. When they crested the first rise, she felt him lean slightly closer. "I meant what I said," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the drumming hooves. "Don't fight. Not yet. Trust me." Sarah stared straight ahead, watching the gang leaders straight back as he guided them into the gathering dark. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but something in the young bandit's voice, in his too familiar eyes, made her wonder if she had any other choice. A torn map fluttered in the pre-dawn breeze, its edges ragged where the gang leader had ripped it into pieces, ensuring no single rider carried the full route. Sarah watched him distribute the fragments among his most trusted men, keeping the largest portion for himself. It was a clever precaution. Even if someone were captured, they couldn't reveal the whole path to their hideout. The night had passed. In a blur of hard riding and brief, tense stops to rest the horses, Sarah's thighs ached from hours in the saddle, but she kept her discomfort hidden, watching and listening instead. The young bandit remained close, his presence a constant shadow that seemed to ward off the crueler elements of the gang. "Water?" he offered now, passing her a canteen. His voice was always soft when he spoke to her, as if afraid others might notice his kindness. Sarah accepted the drink, studying him in the growing light. Without the bandana, she could see more. Of his face, the strong jaw, the slight cleft in his chin that reminded her of old photographs of her father as a young man. The gang leader, the others called him Cain, mounted his horse with fluid grace that belied his age. "Move out," he ordered, his voice carrying across the makeshift camp. "We've got mountain country ahead, and I want the high ground before." In noon, as they rode, the landscape changed gradually, from the familiar ranch country Sarah knew to more treacherous terrain. Rough-edged cliffs rose around them, their shadows harboring secrets and dangers. The torn map in Cain's saddlebag marked a path through this maze of stone and scrub, each fragment a piece of Sarah's fate. "Watch the ridge lines," the young bandit murmured, more to himself than to her. "Always know your escape routes." It was the kind of advice a protective older brother might give, and the thought caught in Sarah's throat like a thorn. Cain led them through a narrow canyon, its walls streaked with ancient watermarks. Two riders could barely pass abreast, making them vulnerable to ambush. Sarah noticed how the young bandit's hand stayed close to his gun, his eyes constantly scanning. The heights. He was young, yes, but trained in survival. "Your father will have gathered a posse by now," he said quietly, as they emerged into a broader valley. "Cain knows it too. That's why we're taking the hard way." Sarah kept her voice equally low. "You seem to know a lot about Cain's thinking." A shadow passed across his face. "I've ridden with him long enough to learn his ways. Had to survive." The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks until heat waves danced across the landscape. Other gang members traded crude jokes and boasts, but the young bandit remained silent, focused. Sarah caught Cain watching them once or twice, his expression unreadable. During a brief stop to water the horses, Sarah overheard two raiders talking. "Kid's gone soft over the girl," one muttered. Cain knows what he's doing," the other cut in. "Always has, where the Mitchells are concerned." The conversation died as Cain approached, but Sarah filed away the exchange, another piece in a puzzle she was struggling to understand. The young bandit returned from scouting ahead, and something in his stance told her he'd heard the men too. They rode on through the heart of the day, the torn map guiding them deeper into increasingly wild country. Sarah recognized some landmarks from her father's stories: Devil's Backbone Ridge, the Broken Tooth Formation. But they were taking paths she'd never heard mentioned, hidden trails that seemed to exist in the spaces between known routes. "How much further?" she asked during another rest stop, watching Cain consult his portion of the map. The young bandit shifted uneasily. "Far enough that rescue would be difficult, near enough that your father won't give up hope." He paused, then added, Cain plays with hope the way a cat plays with a mouse. The afternoon brought them to a high plateau where ancient winds had carved the rocks into fantastic shapes. Cain called another halt, sending riders to check their back trail. Sarah noticed how the young bandit positioned himself between her and the rougher elements of the gang, his protection subtle but constant. "You never told me your name," she said as they shared a strip of dried beef. He hesitated, something like pain flickering in his eyes. "They call me Ghost," he said finally, "because I can slip in and out of places without being seen." "That's not a real name," Sarah pressed, but before he could respond, Cain's sharp whistle cut through the air. "Riders!" The warning came from one of the scouts, and instantly the camp burst into activity. Ghost, if that was truly what he was called, pulled Sarah closer to the rocks, his body again shielding her. "Your father's men," he whispered, "but they're too far behind, and they've lost too much time in the maze." Cain's voice rose above the commotion, cool and controlled. "Mount up. We split here. Tucker, take 4 men and the girl east. Ghost, you ride with them, the rest with me west. We'll meet at the holding place in 2 days. Sarah felt Ghost tense beside her. This wasn't part of the plan, at least not a plan he'd known about. As they mounted up, she caught Cain giving Ghost a hard, meaningful look. A message passed between them, something she couldn't decipher, but that left Ghost's face tight with concern. They rode out as the sun began its descent, the torn map now scattered among even more hands, the path to truth splitting like light through a prism. Sarah watched the dust of Cain's group disappear to the west, while their smaller party turned east into deeper wilderness. Ghost rode closer than ever, his horse matching stride with hers. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "remember what I said about trusting me." Sarah looked at him then, really looked, seeing past the outlaw exterior to something familiar, something that called to her blood. "I remember," she said, "but I'm starting to think I'm not the only one being held captive." "Here." The shadow that crossed his face was answer enough, and they rode on into the gathering dusk, pursued by echoes of the past and the steady hoofbeats of a father's desperate search. In the deep of night, Sarah's fingers traced the outline of her mother's locket, its silver surface cool against her skin. She hadn't realized she was still wearing it until now, hidden beneath her collar. Inside, a tiny photograph showed her family whole, mother, father, herself as a toddler, and baby Thomas barely visible in Mary's arms. The last image taken before everything changed. The outlaws had made camp in a narrow box canyon, their fires burning low against the stone walls. Tucker, the temporary leader of their splinter group, had posted guards at both the entrance and on the rim above, but his attention seemed more focused on the whiskey bottle being passed among his men. Ghost materialized beside her, like his. Namesake, moving with the silence of long practice. "They'll be drunk soon," he murmured, settling against the same boulder that sheltered her from the wind. "Tucker was always a fool that way." Sarah closed the locket quietly, but not before Ghost caught a glimpse of the photograph. Something changed in his expression, a flicker of recognition quickly masked. "That's an old picture," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "My mother always wore it," Sarah replied, watching his face in the dim firelight. "Said it kept her lost ones close to her heart." She paused, then added deliberately, "You can see the baby's birthmark in it, if you look closely enough." Ghost's hand moved unconsciously to his right wrist, hidden beneath his sleeve. The gesture was slight, but Sarah saw it. Her heart began to pound, but she kept her voice steady. "Strange, isn't it? How some marks never fade, no matter how many years pass." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant coyotes and the drunken laughter of Tucker's men. When Ghost finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Some marks go deeper than skin." Sarah's fingers tightened around the locket. "My brother would be about your age now." "Sarah," there was warning in his tone, but also pain. "Some questions are dangerous out here. More dangerous than being kidnapped by outlaws?" She turned to face him fully. More dangerous than the way Kane looked at me, like he was settling. An old score? Ghost glanced toward the fires, but Tucker and his men were deep in their cups now, paying no attention to the whispered conversation in the shadows. Kane has reasons for everything he does, he said carefully, and those reasons usually end in blood, like the night my brother was taken. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Ghost's breathing changed, becoming shallow and quick. His hand moved again to his wrist, this time gripping it as if it pained him. I can't remember that night, he said, so softly she almost missed it. Kane says he found me abandoned, half dead from exposure. Says he raised me like a son. But, Sarah pressed gently, but sometimes, he swallowed hard. Sometimes I dream of a woman singing, of a small hand holding mine, of a ranch house silhouetted against the evening star. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She opened the locket again, tilting it so the firelight caught the tiny image. Look, she whispered. Really look. Ghost hesitated, then leaned closer, his breath caught as he studied the photograph. The woman, she's wearing a shawl, purple and gold. I remember, he broke off, shaking his head as if to clear it. It was our mother's favorite, Sarah said softly. She was wearing it the day she died. A small sound escaped him, something between a gasp and a sob, quickly stifled. His fingers trembled as they reached toward the locket, not quite touching it. I dream of that shawl, he whispered, of how soft it felt against my cheek when she held me. Sarah's own vision blurred with tears. Show me, she said, show me your wrist. If Kane sees, Kane isn't here, show me. Slowly, reluctantly, Ghost pushed up his sleeve. The crescent birthmark stood out clearly against his skin, exactly as Mary had described it countless times, exactly as it appeared in the faded photograph. Thomas, Sarah breathed, the name a prayer in the darkness. He flinched at the sound, but didn't pull away when she touched the mark gently. I didn't know, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Or maybe I didn't want to know. Kane, he's all I can remember clearly. He taught me everything, how to ride, how to shoot, how to survive. Said my real family had thrown me away. That's a lie, Sarah said fiercely. We searched for years. Mother never stopped looking, never stopped believing she'd find you. She died with your name on her lips. Ghost Thomas closed his eyes, tears tracking silently down his face. I have these fragments, like pieces of a dream. A dog barking, a silver rattle, a little girl with red ribbons in her hair. That was me, Sarah whispered. Mother always braided red ribbons in my hair. You used to reach for them, trying to grab them when she held you. A sudden burst of laughter from the fire made them both start. Tucker was telling some crude story, his words slurred with whiskey. The guards had abandoned their posts to join the drinking. Listen to me, Thomas said urgently, gripping Sarah's hands. Kane means to use you to draw father out. There's bad blood there, old hatred I never understood until now. When we reach the holding place, you'll help me escape? Sarah finished. He nodded. But it has to be perfectly timed. Kane has men everywhere, eyes everywhere. If he suspects, he'll kill us both, Sarah said, understanding at last. That's why you've been so careful, so subtle in your protection. I've spent years learning to survive in his world, Thomas replied, learning to be what he wanted while keeping something of myself hidden, even if I didn't know what that something was. He touched the locket gently. Now I know. They sat in silence for a moment, shoulders touching, 15 years of separation beginning to bridge. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Mother always said your mark was put there by angels, so we'd know. When you came home, Thomas smiled faintly, the expression transforming his face into something younger, more vulnerable. Home, he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. I've never had a home, not really. You do now, Sarah said firmly. Once we get away, first we have to survive, he cut in. And that means being careful. Tomorrow, we have to be captor and prisoner again. Whatever you learn, whatever you feel, you can't let it show. Kane sees everything. Sarah nodded, reluctantly releasing his hand. But before they separated, she pressed the locket into his palm. "Keep it," she whispered. "Keep it close. Let it remind you who you really are." Thomas closed his fingers around the silver oval, and for a moment, in the dying firelight, Sarah saw the baby from the photograph in his face. Innocent, untouched by the years of hardship that had followed. Then he slipped away into the darkness, every bit the ghost he'd been named, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of truth and the first real hope she'd felt since the raid. The broken bridle lay in the dust, its leather strap cleanly cut, a silent testament to a plan gone wrong. Sarah stared at it from where she knelt in the dirt, her wrists now bound tight enough to bite into her skin. Tucker stood over her, his rage evident in every line of his body, while Thomas, still ghost to the others, faced him with carefully controlled defiance. The escape attempt had been meticulously planned. With Tucker's men nursing hangovers from the previous night's drinking, the dawn watch had been negligent. Thomas had managed to sabotage 2 of their horses, leaving them with a clear path to the canyon's southern exit. Everything had been perfect until it wasn't. "You really think I'm that stupid ghost?" Tucker spat, his boot nudging the broken bridle. "Think I didn't notice how you've been watching her? How you've kept the others away?" His hand rested meaningfully on his gun. "Cain warned me about your soft heart." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the canyon walls, turning the scene into a stark painting of light and darkness. Sarah could see the other outlaws circling closer, drawn by the confrontation. Thomas stood perfectly still, his stance relaxed in a way that Sarah now recognized as his most dangerous. "The girl's worth nothing dead," Thomas said evenly. "You really want to explain to Cain why his prize hostage tried to escape on your watch?" Tucker's face darkened. "She wouldn't have tried anything if you hadn't encouraged her. Cut her horse loose, did you? Thought you'd play the hero." "I was trying to stop her," Thomas lied smoothly. "Why do you think I caught her before she got to the canyon mouth? You were too busy sleeping off your whiskey to notice she was gone. Until I brought her back." The words carried just enough truth to sting. Tucker had been passed out when Sarah made her escape attempt, waking only to Thomas's shout of discovery. It had been perfectly staged, her running, him pursuing, the capture happening just within sight of the camp. Only now had Tucker pieced together enough to suspect the truth. "Search him," Tucker ordered 2 of his men. "Let's see what other surprises our ghost is hiding." Sarah's heart froze. The locket. Thomas still had their mother's locket. Discovery would reveal everything. But as the men approached, Thomas moved with the liquid grace of long practice. His arms swept up, something silver arcing through the air. The locket caught the sunlight as it flew, drawing every eye. "Looking for this?" Thomas's voice carried clear challenge now. "Took it from her last night. Thought it might be worth something." Tucker snatched the locket from the dust, his thick fingers pawing it open. "Family trinket," he sneered, studying the photograph inside. "Could have told us about this sooner, ghost." "Didn't seem important until she tried to run," Thomas replied. "Now we know why she was so protective of it." Sarah fought to keep her face neutral, understanding Thomas's gambit. By seemingly betraying her confidence, he was establishing his loyalty to the gang. The hurt in her eyes wasn't entirely feigned. Even knowing it was an act, the casual disregard in his voice cut deep. Tucker seemed to accept the explanation, but his suspicion hadn't entirely faded. "Chain her to the wagon," he ordered. "And Ghost, you ride rear guard today. I want you where I can see you." As 2 men dragged Sarah toward the supply wagon, she caught a glimpse of Thomas's face. The mask of indifference was perfect, but in his eyes, she saw an apology and a promise. The game wasn't over. It was just becoming more dangerous. They rode hard through the morning, the broken bridle left behind as a marker of failure. Tucker kept Thomas well away from Sarah, but she could feel her brother's awareness of her like a physical thing. The mother's locket bounced against Tucker's chest, a constant reminder of what they had to lose. The sun climbed higher, baking the canyon walls until the air shimmered with heat. Sarah's bonds chafed with every motion of the wagon, but she refused to show discomfort. She was James Mitchell's daughter, and now she knew she was Thomas Mitchell's sister. Weakness wasn't in their blood. Near midday they heard riders approaching from the west. Everyone tensed, hands moving to weapons, but the distinctive whistle that floated down the canyon was familiar. Kane had caught up with them. The gang leader's expression darkened when he saw Sarah bound to the wagon. "Tucker," he said, his voice carrying that terrible calm. "Explain." While Tucker stammered through his version of events, Sarah watched Kane's eyes move between her and Thomas. There was calculation in that gaze, and something else, something that made her skin crawl. He knew something or suspected something that he wasn't revealing. "Untie her," Kane ordered finally. "She's no good to us injured, and those ropes will leave marks." His gaze settled on Thomas. "Ghost, you'll ride with her. Since you're so good at catching runners, you can be responsible for keeping her close." It was a test, Sarah realized. Kane was watching Thomas's reaction, measuring his response. Her brother gave nothing away, simply nodding, as if the assignment was a mild inconvenience. "And Tucker," Kane added, almost as an afterthought, "the next time you mishandle my property, I'll feed you your own fingers. Clear?" The threat hung in the air like gun smoke as Sarah's bonds were cut. Her wrists were raw and bleeding, but she kept her head high as Thomas helped her mount. His touch was impersonal, correct, but she felt him slip something into her sleeve, a small knife, its handle worn smooth with use. They rode on through the afternoon, the failed escape attempt, adding new layers of tension to the group. The broken bridle lay miles behind them now, but its meaning echoed forward. They had tried for freedom and failed, but in that failure they had learned valuable lessons. Trust was a weapon that cut both ways. Appearances could be armor, and sometimes the most dangerous moment was not the escape itself, but the quiet. That followed. As the sun began to set, Sarah felt Thomas's horse draw slightly closer to hers. To anyone watching, it would seem he was simply guarding her, but his words reached her clearly. "Next time we don't run. Next time we disappear." She gave no sign of hearing, but her fingers found the knife in her sleeve, and she understood. The broken bridle hadn't marked an ending, it had marked a beginning. The real escape would require more than speed and stealth. It would require them to beat Kane at his own game of shadows and secrets. The mother's locket still hung from Tucker's neck, but Sarah no longer mourned its loss. The truth it contained was alive now, burning in her heart and in her brother's. Memories. No piece of silver, no matter how precious, could match the weight of that reality. The wanted poster was yellowed with age, its edges crumbling, hidden in the false bottom of Kane's saddlebag where Thomas had discovered it during his watch. Sarah studied it now by moonlight, her brother keeping guard while she absorbed the shocking revelation it contained. The sketch showed a younger James Mitchell, their father, alongside another man who could only be Kane, both marked for a double. Murder 15 years ago. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, fingers tracing the faded ink. "Father never mentioned this." Thomas crouched beside her, his voice barely audible over the night winds. "Kane keeps it as a reminder. Notice the date, 3 days before I was taken." The pieces began falling into place with terrible clarity. The poster offered $1,000 for information leading to the capture of James Mitchell and Marcus. Kane, wanted for the murder of 2 men in a mining camp dispute, but at the bottom a handwritten note had been added. Mitchell turned state's evidence. Kane convicted. "Kane didn't just take you," Sarah breathed. "He took you for revenge." "He spent 5 years in territorial prison," Thomas confirmed. "By the time he got out, I was already molded into what he wanted. The son of the man who betrayed him, turned into his most loyal ghost." His laugh held no humor. At least that's what he believed. A sound from the main camp made them both freeze, but it was only Tucker turning in his sleep, the mother's locket still gleaming against his chest. Kane had retired to his own tent earlier, after another day of watching them with those calculating eyes. "The murders," Sarah pressed. Did father really? Kane told me the story differently, Thomas said. Said they were claim jumpers who tried to rob them, that he and Mitchell killed them in self-defense. But the law didn't see it that way. He paused. Or maybe father testified to something else entirely. Sarah stared at the poster, remembering her father's face whenever anyone mentioned the year Thomas disappeared. The guilt she'd always assumed was about failing to protect his family now took on a darker shade. There's more, Thomas said quietly. Kane, he has plans. This isn't just about ransom or revenge. He's been watching the Evening Star Ranch for years, learning its weaknesses, its patterns. The raid wasn't random. What does he want? Everything. The ranch, the water rights, the mining claims that come with them. He believes father stole his future, so he's going to take father's future in return. Thomas's hand found hers in the darkness, and he's going to use us to do it. Sarah felt the small knife still hidden in her sleeve, its presence both comfort and burden. How long do we have? 2 days, maybe 3, before we reach the holding place. Once we're there, he left the implications unspoken. The wanted poster seemed to glow in the moonlight, a paper ghost bearing witness to old sins and bitter prices. Sarah carefully folded it and handed it back to her brother. We need to warn father somehow. If Kane's planned this for years, he'll have traps waiting. Already working on it, Thomas murmured. Been marking the trail since we split from the main group, signs only a Mitchell would recognize. Father taught you to read trail signs, didn't he? Sarah nodded, remembering long rides where James had shown her the secret language of the land. The ones he learned in the war? The very same. Kane never knew about those. Thomas smiled slightly. He taught me a lot about survival, but he couldn't teach me what was already in my blood. A cloud passed over the moon, dimming their hidden conference. In the darkness, Sarah could almost imagine they were children sharing secrets in the ranch house, the years of separation melting away. But reality crashed back as Tucker snorted and shifted, the locket catching a stray beam of light. Tell me about Mother, Thomas said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. In my memories, she's just fragments, the shawl, her voice singing. Tell me who she really was. Sarah's throat tightened. She was the strongest person I've ever known, not just in surviving losing you, but in never losing hope. She kept your room ready, kept buying presents for your birthdays. She'd sit in the rocking chair by your window and sing the old songs, certain that somewhere you could hear them. Thomas closed his eyes, pain etching deep lines around his mouth. I did, he whispered. I did hear them. In dreams I couldn't understand. Kane would find me humming them sometimes and get so angry. She had a way of knowing things, Sarah continued. The day she died, she told me to keep watching the evening star, that it would guide lost ones home. I thought she was delirious from her fever, but now here we are, Thomas finished, found each other under these same stars. The wanted poster rustled in his jacket as he shifted, a paper whisper of the past demanding attention. Whatever. Father did back then, Sarah said firmly. He paid for it. Paid with you, with Mother, with 15 years of grief. Kane won't see it that way. Kane sees what he wants to see. He took a baby and told himself he was claiming justice. He raised you to be his weapon and called it revenge. Sarah's voice hardened, but he forgot something important. What's that? Mitchell blood runs deep, deeper than his lies, deeper than his hate. She squeezed his hand. Deep enough to remember home, even when you didn't know what you were remembering. Thomas didn't respond, but his grip on her hand tightened. Above them, the evening star emerged from behind the clouds, bright as the hope in their mother's final prophecy. The wanted poster lay between them, its revelations changing everything and nothing. The past was what it was, but the future was still unwritten. A coyote called in the distance, reminding them that time was passing. Soon they would have to separate, maintain their careful pretense under Kane's watchful eyes. But for now, in this stolen moment, they were simply brother and sister, sharing the weight of truth and the promise of tomorrow. Dawn soon, Thomas murmured. We should... I know. Sarah released his hand reluctantly. Be careful. Kane's suspicions have taught me well how to handle suspicion." He touched the place where the poster lay hidden. "Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight." They parted ways as the first hint of grey touched the eastern sky, each carrying pieces of a truth too heavy for words. The wanted poster had revealed the beginning of their story, but the ending was yet to come, and somewhere, in a ranch house, under the evening star, a father waited, carrying his own burden of past sins and present hopes. The birthmark sketch fell from Sarah's mother's locket when Tucker finally dozed off, his drunken grip loosening enough for Thomas to slip it back. The delicate paper, lovingly preserved inside the silver case, showed a child's drawing of a crescent. Moon labelled in Mary's careful hand, Thomas's mark, drawn by Sarah, age 4. Beneath it, in faded ink, "Never stop looking for the evening star." Thomas stared at his sister's childhood attempt to capture his identifying mark, his fingers unconsciously tracing the identical shape on his wrist. The gang had made camp in a sheltered valley, the horses grazing nearby, as Kane consulted his maps and plotted their final approach to the holding place. "I remember drawing this," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying only to her brother's ears. "Mother kept asking me to do it over and over, making sure I got every detail right. She said, 'Someday I might need to recognize you by it.'" The evening light painted the valley in shades of amber and purple, reminiscent of their mother's beloved shawl. Thomas carefully folded the sketch and returned it to the locket, his movements practiced and silent. "She knew," he said softly. "Even then, she knew we'd find each other." Kane's voice carried across the camp, sharp with authority. "Ghost, take first watch, and keep our guest close. We can't risk another escape attempt this close to the end." The order was both opportunity and threat, Kane's eyes gleaming with unspoken meaning as he watched them move toward the camp's perimeter. Once they were partially concealed by a stand of juniper, Thomas spoke again, his words barely a breath. "He's planning something for tomorrow. I overheard him talking with Tucker, something about a message already sent to the Evening Star Ranch." Sarah's heart clenched. "Father, Kane wants him to come. This whole thing, your capture, the slow pursuit, it's all been carefully orchestrated." Thomas's hand found hers in the growing darkness. "But he doesn't know about the trail signs. Father will be ready." The birthmark on Thomas's wrist seemed to glow in the last light of day, a silver crescent that had guided him home through 15 years of darkness. Sarah touched it gently, remembering all the times their mother had described it, keeping the memory alive. "Tell me about growing up here," Thomas said suddenly. "Tell me about the life I should have had." Sarah's throat tightened, but she forced the words past the pain. "You would have learned to rope with Father like I did. He's the best teacher, patient but firm. Mother would have taught you the piano in the parlor. She always said boys should know music as well as ranching." "There's a piano." Thomas's voice held wonder and grief in equal measure. "Mother's pride and joy. Father had it brought in by wagon all the way from San Antonio for their 10th anniversary. She played it every evening." Sarah paused, memory washing over her. "After you were taken, she'd play lullabies, saying the wind would carry them to wherever you were." Thomas closed his eyes, his face a mask of remembered pain. "I used to dream of music. Kane would find me humming tunes I didn't know I knew. And He stopped, his hand tightening on hers. "He tried to beat every trace of Mitchell out of me, but some things go too deep for even his cruelty to reach." A nightbird called overhead, its cry lonely in the deepening dusk. Sarah shifted closer to her brother, drawing strength from his presence. "When we get home," she promised, "I'll teach you every song Mother knew." "If we get home," Thomas corrected. Gently, "Kane's no fool, he'll be watching for any sign of betrayal. Then we'll be smarter." Sarah's voice held their father's steel. "Mitchell blood, remember?" Thomas smiled faintly, but his eyes remained serious. "There's something else you should know. The wanted poster. It wasn't the only thing Kane kept. He has letters, documents, a proof of old business dealings with father. Whatever happened in that mining camp 15 years ago, it was more complicated than a simple claim dispute. Sarah absorbed this, fitting it into the puzzle of their past. Father never speaks of that time. After you were taken, he threw himself into the ranch, as if building something solid could make up for what was lost. Cain says they were partners once, Thomas continued. Says father betrayed him for a chance at the Evening Star water rights. But Cain, he twists truth like a rope, using it to bind and strangle. The sound of approaching footsteps silenced them. Tucker stumbled into view, whiskey bottle in hand. "Ghost," he slurred. "Boss wants you. Says to bring the girl." They rose together, their brief moment of connection ending, but not broken. As they walked back to the main camp, Sarah noticed how Thomas positioned himself, always between her and potential threat. His protection subtle but constant. Cain stood by the fire, its light casting his face in demonic shadows. "Tomorrow," he announced as they approached, "we finish this. I trust, Ghost, that you remember your part?" "Yes, sir." Thomas's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "Good. Because if anything goes wrong—" Cain's hand moved to his gun, the gesture casual but laden with meaning. "Well, let's just say blood ties can be severed as easily as they're discovered." Sarah felt her brother tense beside her, but his face remained impassive. Cain's words hung in the air like smoke, their double meaning clear. He knew, or at least suspected, the truth about Thomas's identity. The game they were playing had just become infinitely more dangerous. Later, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Sarah caught Thomas watching the Evening Star, his expression haunted. The birthmark sketch lay hidden in the recovered locket, but its image burned in both their memories, a child's drawing that had become a beacon, leading a lost brother home through years of darkness. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Thomas whispered, his eyes still on the star, "remember that some bonds can't be broken. Cain taught me to be a ghost, but Mother—" He touched the locket. "Mother taught me to find my way home, even before I knew I was lost." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the strength that years of hardship had built, but also the vulnerability that Cain had never managed to destroy. Above them, the Evening Star blazed like their mother's hope, guiding them toward a future that would either heal their family's wounds or tear it apart forever. The birthmark on Thomas's wrist caught the starlight, a silver crescent that matched the one their 4-year-old Sarah had drawn with such care. In that simple mark, past and present merged, the lost boy and the man he'd become. The family torn apart, and the siblings found again. Whatever Cain had planned for tomorrow, he hadn't counted on the power of blood ties that ran deeper than revenge, stronger than hate, and truer than any twisted version of justice he might claim. The betrayal. Letter fluttered from Tucker's coat as he fell, shot through the heart by Cain's own gun. The paper, stained now with its bearer's blood, revealed Tucker's secret correspondence with the law in Copper Creek, a desperate attempt to save himself by turning on his companions. But Cain had known. Cain always knew. "Let this be a lesson," Cain announced to the shocked gang, his voice carrying the same terrible calm it had held through the raid. "Loyalty is everything." His eyes fixed on Thomas, the message clear. "Isn't that right, Ghost?" Thomas stood perfectly still, his face an expressionless mask that Sarah had come to recognize as his most dangerous expression. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting the scene in harsh shades of red and gold. Tucker's body cooled in the dust, the mother's locket still gleaming around his neck. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice steady. But Sarah saw his hand twitch toward the knife he'd given her, now hidden in her boot after the letter's discovery had forced them to change positions. Cain holstered his gun with deliberate slowness. Tucker thought he could play both sides, thought he could save himself by selling us out. He nudged the body with his boot. He forgot who taught him everything he knew about survival. The other. Gang members shifted uneasily, their loyalty reinforced by fear. Sarah watched her brother's face, seeing the calculations running behind his careful facade. With Tucker dead, their carefully laid plans needed to change. The trail signs, Thomas, had been leaving, would lead their father into what was now clearly a trap. "Mount up," Kane ordered. "We've wasted enough time. Ghost, you ride point and keep our guest close. We wouldn't want her getting any ideas from Tucker's example." As they rode out, leaving Tucker's body to the vultures already circling overhead, Sarah felt the weight of the betrayal letter in her memory. Kane had staged the entire scene, letting Tucker's treachery play out just to make an example of him. It was a warning, she realized, not just to the gang, but specifically to Thomas. The morning stretched ahead of them, promising heat and hard riding. But now, every hoofbeat carried them closer to a confrontation that had been 15 years in the making. The betrayal letter had changed everything and nothing. In the end, it all came down to loyalty, just as Kane had said. The only question was where Thomas's true loyalty would lead them. And somewhere behind them, following Thomas's hidden signs, James Mitchell rode toward a reunion that could end in either redemption or destruction. The evening star watched it all unfold, silent as the grave that would soon claim more victims before this blood-soaked story reached its end. Thomas's brass compass glinted dully in the fading light as the storm rolled in, its needle swinging wildly in response to the approaching electrical charges. He'd pulled it from his saddlebag when the first signs appeared, dust devils dancing. On the horizon, birds flying low and fast toward shelter, the heavy stillness in the air that preceded violence. "Storm like this could hide an army," Kane muttered, scanning the darkening sky. The afternoon had turned prematurely black, the clouds building into towering anvils shot through with silent lightning. Or a posse. Sarah felt her brother tense. Beside her, knowing he was thinking of their father following his trail signs. In this weather, James Mitchell would have to choose between pursuit and survival. The compass in Thomas's hand trembled with another thunderclap, its wavering needle reflecting their own uncertain path. "We need shelter," Thomas called out, pitching his voice to carry over the rising wind. "There's a box canyon 2 miles east, high walls, narrow entrance, defensible." Kane studied him with those cold eyes, weighing the suggestion against his suspicions. But nature made the decision for them, as the first blast of sand-laden wind hit like a physical blow. "Lead the way, Ghost, but remember, you're responsible for the girl." They rode through deepening darkness, the horses struggling against the wind. Thomas kept the compass out, though it was nearly useless now. Sarah realized he was using it more as a prop, a reason to lead them exactly where he wanted. The box canyon he'd mentioned would be perfect for an ambush, if their father had read the signs correctly and gotten ahead of them. The storm hit, full force, just as they reached the canyon entrance. Stinging sand filled the air, reducing visibility to arm's length. Lightning walked across the canyon rim on spider legs of electricity, illuminating the scene in stark flashes of purple-white. Light. In those brief moments of illumination, Sarah caught glimpses of her brother's face, no longer the mask of Ghost, but something fiercer, more determined. "Secure the horses!" Kane shouted above the wind's howl. "The storm will hold us here till morning." The gang scrambled to obey, fighting against the elements to establish some semblance of camp. Sarah found herself pressed close to her brother as they worked, the storm providing cover for whispered words. "Father will wait," Thomas murmured, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "A storm like this, it's a gift, gives him time to get men in position, or forces him to fall behind," Sarah countered, fear for their father tightening her throat. Thomas's hand found hers briefly, pressing something metal into her palm. The compass. "Keep this close. When the storm breaks, we'll need to move fast. The needle always finds true north. Like Mitchell blood finds home," she whispered back, remembering their earlier conversation. His smile was quick and fierce in the lightning's glare. Exactly like that. The storm raged through the night, nature's fury providing a cover for quiet preparations. The compass lay heavy in Sarah's pocket, its presence a constant reminder of their true direction. Even Cain seemed subdued, perhaps sensing that larger forces than his revenge were now in play. In the darkest hours before dawn, when even the lightning had moved on and only the wind remained, Sarah heard her brother humming softly one of their mother's lullabies. The sound carried on the storm winds like a prayer or a promise, singing of home and hope and the unbreakable bonds of blood. The compass might have lost its true north in the storm's electrical chaos, but Thomas and Sarah had found their own magnetic pull toward family, toward justice, toward a future that the coming dawn would either grant or deny them. James Mitchell's pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest, counting down the hours until dawn. He'd been consulting it regularly through the storm, though its face was barely visible in the darkness of the shallow cave where he and his men had taken shelter. The timepiece had been a gift from Mary on their wedding day, its case inscribed. With words now worn smooth by years of worried fingers, "Love knows no distance." Around him, 6 of his most trusted hands dozed fitfully, their horses crowded at the cave's mouth for protection from the dying storm. Sheriff Mason sat beside him, both men watching the eastern sky for the first hint of grey. They had followed the trail signs through the afternoon, subtle marks that James recognized from his army days, marks he'd taught his daughter years ago. "Those signs," Mason said quietly. "They're military?" James nodded, his fingers finding the watch again. "7th Cavalry. We used them to coordinate raids during the war." He paused, fighting back the memory of another night like this, 15 years ago, when he'd failed to protect his family. "Sarah knows them. I made sure she learned them all. But Cain's man, this ghost who's been leaving them, how would he know?" James closed his eyes, hope and fear warring in his chest. The watch ticked on, each second bringing them closer to a truth he'd barely dared to whisper, even to himself. Unless he's your boy," Mason finished softly. "You're Thomas." The wind moaned outside their shelter, carrying the last remnants of the storm's fury. James had recognized the pattern of the trail signs immediately, not just military precision, but something more personal, something that spoke of Mitchell. Blood and memories too deep for Cain's influence to erase. "Mary always said we'd know him by the mark," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Said angels had touched his wrist so we'd never lose him forever." His laugh held no humor. "But it was Cain who found him. Cain who turned my son into a ghost." Mason shifted, checking his ammunition by touch. "Cain's had 15 years to poison the boy against you. If it is Thomas, then I've got Sarah's life and his soul to fight for." James's hand tightened on the watch. "And this time, I won't fail them." The timepiece had stopped once in all these years, the day Mary died. James had found it frozen at the exact moment. She'd taken her last breath, as if time itself had paused to mark her passing. He'd had it repaired, but sometimes he wondered if it had ever really started again, or if all the years since had been measured in grief and regret. "The storm's breaking," Mason observed, as the wind began to die. "Your man Hank, the one you sent around to the canyon's far end, he'll have his men in position by now." James nodded, feeling the weight of the watch like a promise against his heart. "Cain thinks he's springing a trap for me. Doesn't realize he's riding into one himself." He paused, remembering Mary's faith, her certainty that their family would be whole again. "Whatever happens when the sun rises, Mason, my children come first. Cain's revenge, my old sins, none of that matters compared to bringing them home." The first pale light of dawn began to seep into their shelter. James checked the watch one final time, its steady ticking matching the rhythm of his resolve. Somewhere ahead, in a box canyon chosen with a soldier's eye for tactics, his son and daughter waited, one knowing him as father, the other perhaps remembering him only as betrayer. But blood would tell. Mitchell blood would find its way home, just as Mary had always believed. The watch marked each precious second as the new day approached, carrying with it the chance to heal 15 years of wounds, to fulfill a mother's dying prophecy, to make a broken family whole again. "Time to ride," James said softly, tucking The watch away. The inscription pressed against his heart. Love knows no distance. And now, finally, that distance was about to close. Kane's journal lay open in the pre-dawn light, its pages scattered by the storm's final gusts. Thomas had found it in the saddlebags while checking the horses, its leather cover cracked and worn from years of bitter documentation. Now he and Sarah huddled in the shelter of a rocky overhang, reading by the dim glow of approaching day. June 15th, 1910. Thomas read softly. Mitchell thinks the evening star water rights are his birthright, his destiny. He forgets I'm the one who found the silver trace in the creek bed. I'm the one who knew what that water could mean for mining claims. His testimony tomorrow will steal everything, my freedom, my future. But he'll learn that some prices are paid in blood, not silver. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to another entry, dated 3 days after Thomas was taken. The boy has his father's eyes, his mother's spirit. Breaking both will be my finest revenge. Mitchell's son will become my greatest weapon, raised to destroy everything his father built. Poetic justice for a man who built his ranch on betrayal. But that's not how it happened, is it? A new voice spoke from the shadows. Kane stood watching them, his gun already drawn. Your father's testimony painted me as the killer, him as the innocent witness. But we both pulled triggers that day. We both watched those claim jumpers die. Thomas moved instinctively between Kane and his sister, his voice steady, despite the gun aimed at his heart. You took me to punish him, raised me on lies. Lies. Kane's laugh was hollow. I gave you truth, boy, showed you how cruel the world really is. Mitchell's the one who lives the lie, playing the righteous rancher while standing on a foundation of murder and betrayal. The journal's pages rustled in the strengthening dawn wind, each one filled with 15 years of carefully nurtured hatred. Sarah saw entries tracking her father's every success, every expansion of the ranch, accompanied by Kane's increasingly obsessive plans for revenge. You're wrong about him, Sarah said, her voice carrying her mother's strength. Whatever happened. In that mining camp, he paid for it every day since you took Thomas. Paid for it watching mother die of grief. Paid for it in sleepless nights and empty rooms. Paid for it. Kane's face twisted. 5 years in territorial prison while he built his empire on my discovery. 15 years watching him prosper while I planned and waited. And now, his gun shifted to cover them both. Now he'll pay the full price. His son's blood on his daughter's dress, a father's worst nightmare. But Thomas was no longer the weapon Kane had forged. The journal had revealed the final pieces of a past too long hidden, and with truth came choice. You taught me to be a ghost, he said quietly. Taught me to move silent, to strike without warning. His hand moved slightly, and Sarah saw the knife she'd hidden in her boot, now resting in her brother's grip. But you forgot who I really am. You're my creation, Kane snarled. Everything you are I built. No, Thomas's voice held years of buried memory, of lullabies and evening stars, of blood that ran deeper than revenge. I'm Mary Mitchell's son, and it's time to come home. The journal's pages caught the first ray of true sunlight, its bitter chronicles illuminated just as shouts erupted from the canyon's rim. James Mitchell's voice carried clear in the morning air. Drop your gun, Kane. It's over. Kane's face showed no surprise, only a terrible smile. Right on time, old friend. Come watch me finish what your betrayal started. The journal lay forgotten as dawn broke fully over the canyon, its pages of hatred about to be answered by the stronger bonds of family and the weight of 15 years of love that even Kane's cruelty couldn't erase. Thomas's gun lay in the dust. Between them, his choice made clear as dawn painted the canyon walls gold. It was the weapon Kane had given him years ago, engraved with the words, "Ghost, my loyal son." Now it served as a physical rejection of everything Kane had tried to make him become. Pick it up, Kane commanded, his own gun still trained on Sarah. "Pick it up and prove whose son you really are." James Mitchell's voice carried down from the rim again, closer now. "Sarah! Thomas!" The sound of his children's names in their father's voice seemed to push Kane over some final edge. His face twisted into something barely human, years of hatred, crystallizing into this single moment. "Call them all you want, Mitchell. Watch what your lies have bought them." But Thomas stood his ground, empty hands raised, body still shielding his sister. "You taught me to be a ghost," he said quietly, "but Mother taught me to find my way home. Even before I knew who I was, her love was stronger than your hate. Love." Kane spat the word like poison. "Love didn't build the evening star. Murder did. Betrayal did. Your precious father's hands are as bloody as mine." "Maybe they are." James Mitchell's voice came from behind them now, steady and clear. He'd managed to work his way down into the canyon during their confrontation. But blood washes clean. Hatred just stains deeper. Kane's gun swung toward James, then back to Sarah, torn between targets. The weapon Kane had given Thomas still lay in the dust, sunlight gleaming along its barrel, while above them the evening star made a final appearance in the brightening dawn. "It's over, Kane," James continued, moving slowly forward. "The ranch, the silver, the revenge, none of it matters compared to family." "Family." Kane's laugh was edged with madness. "I gave your son a purpose, made him strong while you grew." "Soft on ranch money." "You stole a child," Sarah's voice rang with her mother's steel. "Tried to turn love into hate, but Mitchell blood runs deeper than your poison." Thomas hadn't moved, his shadow stretching toward the gun at his feet like a line drawn between past and future. When he spoke, his voice carried all the quiet certainty of a man finally finding his true name. "I remember," he said softly, "Mother singing me to sleep. Remember Sarah's red ribbons. Remember love that survived 15 years of your lies." His eyes met Kane's with unflinching clarity. "I choose my family." The canyon held its breath as Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. But blood and love and truth had already won their victory. The ghost had found his way home, leaving Kane alone with his bitter revenge, standing in the dawn light of a new day that offered either redemption or destruction. Mary's medicine box sat open on the ranch house kitchen table, its contents spread out just as she'd left them 15 years ago. Sarah's hands moved with practiced care, cleaning the graze on Thomas's arm, where Kane's final shot had struck before Sheriff Mason's bullet found its mark. The familiar scent of witch hazel and comfrey rose from the old tin box, carrying memories of their mother's gentle touch. "She kept everything organized just so," Sarah explained, selecting a bandage. "Said a healer's hands need to know where. Every remedy lives." Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked, the morning's violence still too fresh. "She would have known exactly how to help you." Thomas sat quietly, watching his sister tend his wound with their mother's tools. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, catching the silver of the medicine box's lid where Mary's initials were engraved. Outside, they could hear their father talking with the sheriff, handling the aftermath of Kane's final stand. "I remember this smell," Thomas said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "When I'd scrape my knees as a toddler, she'd open this box and the whole room would fill with herb scent." He touched the box's worn edge gently. "Kane never understood why certain smells would make me cry." Sarah's hands stilled on the bandage. "She used it the night you were taken. Tried to treat the wounds of the ranch hands Kane's men had hurt. Kept saying if she could just heal them faster, they could ride out and find you." She swallowed hard. The box stayed open on this table for days, waiting, their father's boot. The steps on the porch silenced them both. James Mitchell entered slowly, as if uncertain of his welcome in this moment of private healing. His eyes fell on the medicine box, and something in his face crumpled. "Mary always said," he spoke softly, "that love was the strongest medicine." He moved to stand behind Thomas's chair, his hand hovering over his son's shoulder, before finally, gently, settling there. "She was right about so many things. Thomas leaned almost imperceptibly into his father's touch as Sarah finished binding his wound. The medicine box stood between them on the table, a bridge across 15 years of separation, its contents still healing hurts both physical and spiritual. Outside, the law was dealing with the aftermath of Cain's hatred. But here in the kitchen, surrounded by the scents of their mother's healing herbs, 3 broken pieces of a family began the longer, harder work of becoming whole again. The new ranch brand glowed red-hot in the forge, its design combining the traditional evening star mark with a subtle crescent moon. Thomas's birthmark transformed into a symbol of family reunion. James Mitchell held it up for his children's inspection, his weathered face softened by a smile that was becoming more frequent these days. "Your mother always said that Mark was heaven-sent," he said, setting the brand aside to cool. "Seems fitting to make it part of our legacy now." Thomas ran his fingers over his wrist, where the crescent birthmark had guided him home. A month had passed since Cain's fall, and each day brought small victories in the battle to reclaim his place in the family. The brand would mark the first calves born under this new chapter of Mitchell history. "The hands have started calling it the Ghost Star brand," Sarah said, her eyes twinkling. "They say it's good luck, Mark's cattle that always find their way home, no matter how far they stray." The forge's warmth filled the barn with comfortable heat as evening approached. Through the open door, they could see ranch life continuing. Horses in the corrals, cattle in the distant pastures, hands going about their work. But now there was a new rhythm to it all, a sense of wholeness restored. "I've been meaning to ask," Thomas said, his voice carefully casual, "if you'd teach me about the water rights, the legal side of running the ranch." He paused, meeting his father's eyes. Cain wasn't wrong about everything. That water's valuable, worth protecting the right way. James set down his tools, understanding the deeper meaning in his son's words. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be faced honestly, its lessons learned and its wounds healed clean. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Your mother would have liked it too. She always said the evening star was meant for both her children." Sarah touched the cooling brand gently, feeling the promise in its merged symbols. "Ghost Star," she mused, "a fitting name for a new beginning." Outside, the evening star itself appeared in the darkening sky, watching over 3 people who had found their way back to each other. The new brand would mark more than cattle. It would mark the point where a family's broken trail finally led home. The new family portrait hung in the place of honor above the fireplace, replacing the old one that had shown only 3 Mitchells. In this image, captured by a traveling photographer, Thomas stood tall beside his father, Sarah seated between them, all 3 faces bearing the same quiet strength. But it was the empty chair positioned deliberately in the frame that spoke loudest, Mary's place, forever honored in the family circle. Thomas often found himself studying the photograph in quiet moments, seeing in it everything Cain had tried to destroy. The Mitchell features were clear in his face, now that he knew to look for them. His father's jaw, his mother's eyes, Sarah's determined set of chin. More than physical resemblance, though, the portrait captured belonging. "Mother would have loved this," Sarah said, joining him by the fireplace. She'd been playing their mother's piano, its notes filling the house again after years of silence. She always said pictures capture more than faces. They capture souls. The evening light slanted through the windows, catching the silver frame. Just as James entered from his day's work, he paused, as he always did now, to look at his complete family, both in the portrait and in life. "Found something today?" he said, pulling a small package from his vest. "Who was going through the old tack room, and there it was, wrapped in your mother's shawl." He handed it to Thomas. Inside lay a small wooden horse, crude but lovingly carved. On its base, in childish letters, "For baby Thomas, love Sarah." The portrait watched over them as brother and sister shared a look of pure recognition, remembering a long-ago Christmas and a gift thought lost forever. Like the family itself, it had simply been waiting to be found. The sunrise view from Thomas's bedroom window remained exactly as Mary had described it in her final days. a perfect crown of light rising over the distant hills, turning the Evening Star Ranch into a kingdom of gold. He stood there now, watching the dawn just as his mother once had, seeing in it the promise she'd never lost faith in. Sarah found him there, as she often did these mornings. Mother used to say the sunrise reminded her of that hymn. "Great is thy faithfulness," she said softly. "Morning by morning new mercies we see." Below in the yard, their father was already at work, his voice carrying up to them as he directed the ranch hands. The Ghost Star brand marked their growing herd now, its unique design a testament to loss overcome and family restored. Thomas touched the window glass, feeling the warmth of the rising sun. "I remember her singing that," he said. "Even when, Kane, even during the worst times, that melody would come to me. Like she was still holding me, still believing I'd find my way back." "She knew," Sarah replied simply. "The same way she knew what the Evening Star meant. The same way she knew your birthmark was heaven's promise." The sunrise painted there, faces in the same golden light, brother and sister standing in the spot where their mother had kept her vigil. Outside, the Evening Star Ranch wakened to a new day, its legacy renewed in the children who had found their way home, morning by morning. Faithful as the dawn,